Welcome to your deep dive into Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. We're going to unpack some of these fascinating insights into how our minds actually, really work, especially when it comes to decision making. And you've shared some specific sections you were curious about, so I think we can just get right to it.
Yeah, sounds good to me. I'm ready.
Okay, so Kahneman's big idea is that we've got these two thinking systems. System one is fast, intuitive, emotional, like our autopilot. It's great for those quick judgments, but it can also, lead to some interesting biases. Then there's system two, the slower, more deliberate and logical side. But the problem is it's a bit lazy and doesn't always, kick in when we really need it to.
Right. Yeah, and that tension between those two systems is really at the heart of a lot of these surprising findings in the book.
Okay, so you highlighted a section on heuristics and biases, so I think that's a good place to start. Kahneman calls these mental shortcuts heuristics, which is what System 1 uses to make those snap decisions. But, sometimes those shortcuts, they lead us down the wrong path, and that's where these biases can come in.
Exactly. One of the biases I think you were interested in is this law of small numbers. And that's our tendency to overgeneralize from small samples.
Right.
We see a pattern. Maybe it's just based on a couple of instances, and we assume it's going to apply really broadly.
So it's like if you've had a couple bad experiences with a certain brand of car, you just assume all cars of that brand are unreliable.
Yes. Or think about, the example that Kahneman gives about the Gates Foundation investing really heavily in small schools. Their reasoning was based on this research that showed that the top-performing schools were often small. But they didn't account for the fact that small schools also just tend to have more extreme outcomes, both good and bad, just due to chance.
So they kind of jump to a conclusion based on this, limited data, assuming that small size was a cause of success. What I think is so fascinating is how this can affect all of us. It's not just these big institutions. How do you think this law of small numbers could affect our everyday decisions?
Well, think about how you evaluate restaurants.
Yeah.
Say you try a new place once, you have one bad meal. Are you likely to just write it off completely?
Oh, probably. Yeah.
Even though it could have just been an off night. Or think about online reviews.
Right.
If you see a product with only a few 5-star ratings, you might assume it's amazing, even though a larger sample size would give you a more accurate picture.
That's a really good point. So just being aware of that law of small numbers can help us to avoid making these hasty judgments and remind us to seek out more data before we really form strong opinions about things.
Absolutely. It really encourages us to be more critical thinkers, I think, and to consider alternative explanations before we jump to conclusions.
Right. Another bias that you highlighted was anchoring. This shows how easily our estimates can be influenced by a totally random initial number.
Right.
It's almost like our minds get fixated on that first piece of information, even if it's irrelevant.
The classic example from the book is this study where people spun a wheel of fortune, and then they had to estimate the percentage of African nations that were in the UN. And those who spun a higher number guessed a higher percentage, even though the wheel had absolutely nothing to do with the right answer.
Right. It's almost as if that random number set a baseline in their minds.
Exactly. And this bias isn't just limited to these abstract estimations. Think about salary negotiations.
Right.
If a potential employer starts with a really low offer, you might, without even realizing it, adjust your own expectations down just based on that anchor.
Interesting.
Even if you're worth a lot more.
So being aware of anchoring can help us to be more savvy in negotiations.
Absolutely.
Don't let that initial number, whether it's a price or a timeline or, whatever it is, unduly influence your thinking. Do your research, know your worth, and don't be afraid to counteroffer with a number that reflects that.
I love here, connecting this directly back to how we can use this knowledge. It's not just about understanding the bias, but it's about how to counteract it in these real-world situations.
Exactly. Now let's talk about this availability heuristic. So this one's all about how easily we recall examples and how that influences our judgments about how likely something is to happen.
Right. Something's really easy to remember. We tend to think it's more common than it actually is. And, really vivid or emotionally charged events, those really stick in our minds.
Yeah.
And it makes them seem more frequent.
Kahneman uses the example of seeing a wrecked car on the side of the road. Suddenly, accidents feel more probable, even if statistically they're not.
Right. Exactly. And this bias can really have a big impact on how we perceive risk. So, think about media coverage of crime. If you're constantly seeing, these news stories about burglaries, you might start to feel like your neighborhood is less safe, even if the crime rate hasn't actually changed.
That reminds me of how social media can do that, too. It can amplify certain events and make them seem more like widespread or significant than they really are. Just because something's trending, it doesn't mean it's representative of the bigger picture.
That's a great point. Yeah, the availability heuristic shows us how our own experiences and the information we're exposed to, they could really shape our perception of reality, even if that perception isn't always accurate.
So I guess being aware of the availability heuristic can help us to be more critical consumers of information. We can question our assumptions and seek out a wider range of perspectives and not let those, really easily available examples kind of dominate our thinking.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the limits of our own experience and actively seeking out, a more balanced view.
Right. So let's move from how we judge probability to how the way information is presented, the frame, can really influence our choices. This is like the concept of framing.
Yeah, framing is really fascinating because it shows how even really subtle wording changes can have a huge impact on our decisions.
Yeah.
Even if the underlying options are exactly the same.
It's like that classic experiment where people are given the choice between a sure gain of $500 or a 50% chance of winning $1,000. Most people go for that sure gain, even though the gamble has a higher expected value.
Right. But when those same options are framed as losses, like, a sure loss of $500 versus a 50% chance of losing $1,000, people suddenly become more risk-seeking. They're willing to gamble just to avoid that sure loss.
The really cool part is that researchers have actually used brain imaging to study this. Different areas of the brain light up depending on how a decision is framed.
Right.
Showing that, physical impact of framing on our decision making.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really takes framing from this abstract concept to something that's tangible, something we can measure.
And it's not just some, academic curiosity either. Like, framing has these real world implications from how, products are marketed to how policies are debated.
Think about how tax policy is discussed. A tax cut can be framed as, tax relief or as a loss of government revenue.
Right.
Same policy, two very different frames. And each one evokes this whole set of emotions and associations.
It really highlights how the way information is presented can shape our perceptions and ultimately, influence the choices that we make.
Absolutely. So recognizing the power of framing, I think, can help us to be more discerning consumers of information.
Right.
And to make more conscious decisions, based on the substance of the issue, rather than being swayed by just how it's presented.
Speaking of how things are presented, Kahneman also talks about this MPG illusion, which shows how the way fuel efficiency is framed can be so misleading.
Yeah. So miles per gallon focuses on how far you can drive on a single gallon, right? Which makes us underestimate the impact of fuel-efficient cars. So improving from 10 to 20 miles per gallon, that actually saves way more gas than improving from 30 to 50 miles per gallon, even though the difference in MPG is the same.
It's all about how much gas you're using per mile driven, not just the miles that you can get out of a gallon.
Yeah.
And this research actually led to new car stickers in the U.S. that include information about gallons per mile to help consumers make more informed choices.
Yeah. It's a really great example of how understanding framing can lead to these, real-world improvements.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about this concept that you found really intriguing, the idea of the two selves. So Kahneman argues that we have this experiencing self, which lives in the moment, and then we have this remembering self, which focuses on the peak and the end of an experience while neglecting the duration.
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea because it suggests that our memories of an experience aren't always, these completely accurate reflections of how we felt while we were actually living it.
The book uses that example of medical procedures. We might remember a longer procedure as better because the ending was less painful, even though we actually endured more pain overall.
Right, because the remembering self prioritizes the, those most intense moments and that final feeling rather than the total amount of pain or pleasure that was actually experienced.
That's a good point to stop for today. In the next part, we'll continue exploring Kahneman's book, focusing on how these two selves impact our judgments and decisions.
I look forward to it. This has been a really great start. Welcome back. I'm ready to continue our deep dive into thinking fast and slow. Where did we leave off?
Right. We were about to get into how our two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self, influence our judgments and decisions.
Ah, yes, a very fascinating concept. It challenges us to consider, like, how our memories actually shape our overall well-being.
Exactly. It's not just about, what we experience in the moment, but how we remember it later.
Right.
And those two things don't always, line up, as Kahneman points out.
Yeah, he uses the example of, like, vacation. So imagine you go on this week-long vacation to a beautiful resort, mostly sunny days, delicious food, relaxing activities. But on the last day, it rains nonstop, and you miss your flight home.
Oh, I can picture that.
Right.
Even though most of the trip was amazing, that final bad experience would probably overshadow everything else in my memory.
Exactly. So your remembering self might focus on that negative ending, leading you to just recall the vacation less fondly than you actually experienced it.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we can't always trust our memories to be these perfectly accurate reflections of, past experiences.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears a bit, I want to touch on this concept of the illusion of truth.
Okay, the illusion of truth. Tell me more about that.
Well, it turns out that we're more likely to believe something is true if it's easy to, process and understand.
Okay.
So, familiar phrases, rhyming statements, things that are repeated often, those all kind of feel more true to us, even if they're not.
Yeah, that makes sense. If something feels familiar or, flows smoothly in our minds, we're less likely to question it.
Exactly. And this can be, exploited,
Right.
especially in, advertising or even propaganda. Just think about how slogans and jingles often use rhymes and repetition to make their message stick.
It's like those earworm jingles that you just can't get out of your head, even if you don't even like the product, is because they're so easy to remember, and that familiarity makes them seem more credible.
Right, exactly. So I think being aware of this illusion of truth can help us to be more critical thinkers, and we can pause and question those assumptions and really evaluate the substance of a message, rather than just being swayed by how catchy or how familiar it sounds.
It's a good reminder to not take things at face value just because they sound good or have been repeated a million times.
Now let's delve into another kind of intriguing concept, cognitive ease.
Okay, cognitive ease. What's that about?
So cognitive ease refers to how smoothly our minds are processing information. So if something just feels really easy to understand, we tend to associate it with those positive feelings, like truth, familiarity, safety.
Okay, so if a message is presented very clearly and simply, we're more likely to trust it.
Exactly. Think about how you feel when you read a well-written article, versus one that's full of jargon and all these convoluted sentences.
Right.
The clear, concise article is more likely to leave you feeling, informed and confident, while the really complex one might make you feel, confused or even distrustful.
It makes me think about the importance of clear communication. If you want your message to really resonate, you need to present it in a way that's easily digestible. You know what I mean?
Right. Absolutely. And that applies to everything from writing emails to giving presentations to even having difficult conversations. When we make that effort to communicate clearly, we increase those chances that our message is really going to be understood and well received.
Yeah, so cognitive ease isn't just about making things simple. It's about fostering trust and understanding.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about the focusing illusion.
Okay, the focusing illusion. I'm curious about this one.
So the focusing illusion highlights how we tend to overestimate the impact of specific events on our overall happiness.
So we might think that getting a promotion or, winning the lottery is going to make us eternally blissful. But in reality, the effect on our happiness might be way less dramatic and long-lasting than we imagine.
Right, exactly. Kahneman gives this example of climate. So when people are asked about how much they like living in California versus, say, the Midwest, those in California rate their climate much more favorably. However, when you actually look at their overall life satisfaction, there's no difference between the two groups.
Interesting. So it's we get so fixated on that one aspect, in this case the weather, that we overestimate its influence on, our overall happiness.
Right. And this bias can actually work both ways.
Yeah.
We might dwell on a negative event like a breakup or job loss and just assume it's going to forever doom our happiness. But in reality, we're way more resilient than we think.
So the focusing illusion reminds us to consider that bigger picture and not let one single element, whether it's positive or negative, dominate our view of our lives.
Now, speaking of focusing on certain elements, Let's talk about how our minds are really wired to seek these causal explanations, even when they might not exist.
This sounds like a recipe for some serious misinterpretations.
It certainly can be.
Yeah.
Kahneman points out, how eager our brains are to find patterns and connections, even in totally random events. So he gives this fascinating example of how bond prices initially rose on the day that Saddam Hussein was captured in Iraq. And all the news outlets immediately, attributed this to investors seeking safer assets.
Oh, so they assumed there was this, causal link between those two events?
Exactly. But then bond prices fell back.
Yeah.
And so then the explanation promptly shifted to, well, investors were more willing to invest in riskier assets now that Saddam Hussein was captured. So the point is, both of these explanations seem totally plausible after the fact, even though they, contradict each other.
Right. It's such a good example of how our desire to just make sense of the world, it can lead us to create these narratives that fit the events, even if they aren't actually accurate.
Exactly. And this bias towards those causal explanations can have really significant consequences.
Yeah.
It can lead us to misinterpret data, draw faulty conclusions, and make decisions that are based on these spurious correlations.
This makes me think about, how easily we can fall prey to conspiracy theories, which often rely on just connecting these totally unrelated events to create this grand narrative.
That's a great example. Conspiracy theories really thrive on that innate desire to just find patterns and meaning, even in the absence of any real evidence. And so I think, understanding that bias can help us to be more discerning and just avoid jumping to those conclusions that are based on really flimsy connections.
So how can we guard against that tendency to see causes where there might be none?
Well, it's about cultivating this, this healthy skepticism.
Okay.
And being willing to question our own assumptions. Just because two things happen close together doesn't automatically mean one caused the other.
Right. Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Now let's explore another mental shortcut that can often lead us to, biased decisions. And that's substitution.
Substitution, I'm not familiar with that one.
So substitution is what happens when we're faced with this really difficult question. And without even realizing it, our system one kind of substitutes it with an easier related question.
Okay. So we're essentially answering the wrong question without even knowing it.
Exactly. So imagine you're asked to estimate the likelihood of a particular political candidate winning an upcoming election. That's a really complex question. It involves all these different factors.
Right.
But instead of carefully analyzing those factors, you might find yourself substituting it with a much easier question, how much do I like this candidate?
Yeah, I see. So instead of actually engaging in, a thoughtful analysis of their policies and their chances of winning, I'm just basing my judgment on my gut feeling about them.
Right, exactly. And while our gut feelings can sometimes be accurate, they're not always reliable, especially when it comes to these, complex issues.
But how can we avoid falling into that trap of substitution?
Well, it's about recognizing when we're simplifying a question without even realizing it. So if you find yourself answering a question that just feels too easy or relies too heavily on your gut feeling, that might be a sign that you're substituting.
So we need to be more mindful of the questions that we're asking ourselves, I guess, and make sure that we're not taking those mental shortcuts that could lead us to, make decisions that are biased.
Now, let's talk about the realm of prediction, which is inherently tricky because it involves so much uncertainty.
Yeah, I'm curious about this because, we're always making predictions, whether it's, how long a project is going to take or how a particular situation is going to unfold.
Right. We all make predictions, and it's totally natural to want to be right. But Kahneman highlights several different biases that can really skew our predictions and that can lead to these inaccurate forecasts and even potentially really costly mistakes.
Yeah, one that I'm definitely guilty of is this planning fallacy, which is our tendency to seriously underestimate how long it's going to take to complete a task, even when we have, past experience to draw on.
Yeah, it's really pervasive bias that affects individuals and organizations alike. And we tend to just focus on that best case scenario and totally ignore potential setbacks and delays.
Right. So we're essentially planning for an idealized version of reality, not the messy, unpredictable one that we actually live in.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so crucial to just be way more realistic in our planning, anticipating those potential problems and building in that buffer time, just to account for those unexpected delays.
That makes me think about how project timelines often get so derailed because all these unforeseen issues pop up. It's almost as if we're wired to be like overly optimistic about our ability to like control the future.
Another bias that can really distort our predictions is the illusion of skill.
Okay. The illusion of skill, what's that about?
So the illusion of skill is our tendency to just overestimate our ability to predict the future, especially in domains that are inherently unpredictable, like the stock market or political elections.
No, I've definitely seen that in action. People get so confident in their like stock picking abilities, even though the market is notoriously volatile.
Yeah. Kahneman cites research showing that like the performance of actively managed mutual funds, which are run by, these so-called professional investors, consistently underperforms index funds, which are just tracking, a specific market index.
Wow. So even experts can fall prey to that illusion of skill.
Absolutely. It's like a humbling reminder that we all need to be wary of that overconfidence.
Yeah.
Especially when we're dealing with, these complex, unpredictable systems.
Yeah. So how can we like guard against that illusion of skill?
Well, I think it's about recognizing the limits of our own knowledge and just being willing to admit when we just don't know something. It's also about acknowledging the role of like chance and luck in many outcomes.
Yeah, so rather than assuming that we can predict the future with like absolute certainty, we should approach predictions with like a little more humility.
Absolutely.
And be open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
I think that's a really great way to put it. Humility is a powerful tool when it comes to making predictions.
This has been like a fascinating discussion so far. We've covered so much ground, from heuristics and biases to like the illusion of truth and the focusing illusion.
And we're not done yet. In our final segment, we'll explore some more of those groundbreaking ideas, including prospect theory and the endowment effect. So stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into thinking fast and slow. We've been exploring all these fascinating concepts about, how our minds work. What's next on the agenda for this final part?
Okay, well, we're going to get into a concept that I think really challenges traditional economic theory. It's called prospect theory. And it's one of Kahneman's most significant contributions, I think, to the field of behavioral economics.
Prospect theory, okay, it sounds a bit intimidating. Can you break it down for me?
Yeah, so prospect theory is basically a framework for, how people make decisions when there's risk and uncertainty involved.
Yeah.
And it kind of challenges that, traditional economic assumption that people are always rational.
Right.
And, always choose the option that has that highest expected value.
So it's basically about how we, weigh potential gains and losses when we're making choices.
Exactly. And one of the, I think, key insights of prospect theory is this idea that losses loom larger than gains in our minds.
Okay.
So the pain of losing, let's say, $100, it's actually felt more intensely than the pleasure of gaining $100.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's that old saying, right? It hurts more to lose than it feels good to win.
Exactly. And this loss aversion that we have can really have a big impact on our behavior. So it explains why we might be so reluctant to take risks, even when the potential gains outweigh the losses.
So Kahneman describes that classic experiment where people are given the choice between a sure gain of $500 or a 50% chance of winning $1,000.
Right.
And most people go for that, sure gain, even though the gamble has the higher expected value.
Right, exactly. And that really just demonstrates our inherent risk aversion when it comes to potential gains. We want that certainty, even if it means settling for that smaller reward.
But then when the scenario is flipped to losses, like a sure loss of $500 versus a 50% chance of losing $1,000, people suddenly become more risk-seeking.
Right.
They're willing to gamble to avoid that sure loss.
Right. And that shift from risk aversion to risk seeking is a key insight of prospect theory. We're way more willing to take a risk when we're just trying to avoid a loss.
Yeah.
Even if it means we're exposing ourselves to, a potentially even bigger loss.
It helps explain, I think, why people might hold on to these losing investments for too long. They're hoping it'll bounce back, or why they might make these risky bets just to try to recoup their, previous losses.
Absolutely. Yeah, loss aversion can really significantly impact our financial decisions and sometimes, lead us to make choices that aren't in our best interest in the long run.
Now let's get into another fascinating, I think, aspect of prospect theory. That's the endowment effect.
Yeah. So the endowment effect, that's our tendency to value something more just because we own it.
So if I own something, it automatically becomes more valuable to me, even if it's not something that I would have necessarily bought in the first place.
Right. Exactly. So Kahneman He describes a study where participants were just randomly given, like a coffee mug or a chocolate bar, and then they're given the opportunity to trade their item for the other one.
Okay.
And, surprisingly, very few people actually chose to trade.
Huh.
They kind of developed this, attachment to the item they were randomly assigned, even if they didn't have, any prior preference for it.
That's really interesting. It's like ownership just, creates this illusion of value.
Right. And the endowment effect, I think, highlights how irrational, human behavior can be and how easily we get, attached to things, even if those things don't have much intrinsic value.
That makes me think about how hard it is to, to declutter our home.
Absolutely.
We hold on to things we don't need or even use just because we've, gotten used to having them around.
Right, exactly. The endowment effect can really explain why we struggle so much to let go of our possessions, even when they're not serving us anymore.
So how can we counteract that endowment effect? How can we become more objective in our, valuations?
Well, I think it's about recognizing that ownership doesn't actually inherently increase value.
Oh, okay.
So when you're thinking about whether to, keep something or sell it, try to, detach yourself from that feeling of ownership and just evaluate the item, based on its actual qualities and its usefulness.
I like that tip. Now, shifting gears a bit, I want to talk about expert intuition.
Yeah.
Earlier, we talked about how these heuristics and biases can, lead us astray.
Okay.
But Kahneman acknowledges, that intuition can actually be a really valuable tool in certain situations.
Right. Yeah. So in environments with stable patterns and regularities, our intuitions can actually be surprisingly accurate.
Okay.
Especially if we have a lot of experience in that domain.
So, I'm imagining a chess master who can just look at the board and, make a move based on their intuition without, actually consciously going through every single possible outcome.
Right, exactly. Or a really seasoned doctor, who can quickly diagnose a patient just based on a cluster of symptoms. These are all experts who have accumulated this vast storehouse of knowledge and experience. That allows them to make these judgments that, might seem like magic to an outsider.
Right. But, it's important to remember that intuition's not infallible.
Oh, absolutely. It's not foolproof.
Yeah.
Intuition is only really reliable in those environments where there are those really clear patterns and feedback loops. So in situations that are really unpredictable or novel, our intuitions, they can be really misleading.
So trying to predict the stock market or, the outcome of an election.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Those are domains where chance and uncertainty play a huge role. And our intuitions are they're unlikely to be very accurate.
So I guess the key takeaway is to be aware of the limitations of our intuition. We can trust those gut feelings in areas where we've got that, expertise and experience.
Right.
But we really need to be, I think, much more cautious and analytical when it comes to those situations that are more complex and unpredictable.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Well, we've covered so much in this deep dive into thinking fast and slow. We've explored, how those two thinking systems work, that power of heuristics and biases, that surprising influence of framing, and, the importance of understanding both the strengths and the limitations of our intuitions.
Yeah, it's been a very fascinating journey, I think, through all the complexities of human thought.
And, I think the most important takeaway for me is by understanding how our minds work, we can become more aware of, those biases that we have. We can make more informed choices and ultimately live more, fulfilling lives.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, as they say. And this book, it really gives us a powerful toolkit, I think, for navigating the world, with more clarity and wisdom.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into thinking fast and slow. We hope you've gained some valuable insights, into how your own mind works.
Until next time, keep those brains engaged and, remember to question everything.
恭喜你又听完了一本书，订阅以便不错过更多精彩节目，也别忘了分享给你的朋友，一起快乐听书学英语。